The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, and it told Phineas Carson that he had exactly 30 days to decide whether Redemption, New Mexico Territory, was worth the rest of his life, or whether he ought to pack his saddlebags and ride back east to Philadelphia, where his father's law firm waited for him like a patient creditor. Phineas sat outside the telegraph office on the main street of Redemption and read the telegram twice, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more generous. They did not. His father had been nothing if not economical with his language. Come home by June or we dissolve the partnership arrangement. The firm needs a decision. You need a direction. 30 days, Phineas. Make something of yourself out there, or admit that the territory is not where a Carson belongs. He folded the telegram and tucked it into the breast pocket of his coat, which was still the dark wool kind that men wore back east and which made him look, as the barkeep at the Dusty Spur had told him the previous week, like a man who had arrived somewhere he had not intended to arrive. That assessment was not entirely wrong. Phineas had come to Redemption 8 months earlier at the invitation of his old friend Thomas Aldrich, who had promised him that the territory was alive with opportunity for a young lawyer with ambition and a good education. Thomas had been right about the territory being alive. He had been somewhat less accurate about the opportunities, because Thomas had died of a fever 6 weeks after Phineas arrived, and with him had gone most of the professional connections and local knowledge that would have made the practice viable. Phineas had spent the subsequent months managing minor land disputes and drafting the occasional will, earning barely enough to keep a room above the hardware store and feed his horse, a gray gelding he had named Franklin after his maternal grandfather. 30 days. He looked up and down the street of Redemption, taking inventory of what he had come to know in 8 months. There was the Dusty Spur Saloon and the general store run by a man named Horace Webb, and the livery stable and the small white-painted church at the far end of the street, and the doctor's office and the land office, and the scattered homes and ranches that spread out from the town like spokes from a wheel. There was the red mesa to the west that turned a deep burgundy at sunset, and the cottonwood trees along the creek that were just now coming into new leaf. There was, if he was honest with himself, not much that would make a Philadelphia man's heart sing with the certainty of permanence. He stood up, tucked the telegram more firmly into his pocket, and decided that since the day was already ruined, he might as well ride out to the Mallory Ranch and deliver the deed transfer he had completed 2 days ago. The Mallorys lived 6 miles north of town, and the ride would give him time to think, and thinking was the only thing he was presently equipped to do. He collected Franklin from the livery, exchanged a few words with the stable hand, a boy of about 15 named Cody, and rode north on the road that ran alongside the Cottonwood Creek. The territory was beautiful in the late April morning. He could admit that without any reservation whatsoever. The sky was a blue that seemed to exist nowhere else in the world, a deep, impossible blue that made the eye feel as though it was receiving a gift it had not asked for. The sage rolled away on either side of the road in silver-green waves, and the air smelled of it, clean and sharp, and the distant mountains were purple and snow-capped and utterly indifferent to the business of men. He had been riding for perhaps 20 minutes when he came around a wide bend in the road, and very nearly rode Franklin directly into a wagon that had stopped crosswise in the narrow lane. He pulled up sharply, Franklin dancing sideways with a snort of complaint, and Phineas got control of the gelding and looked at the wagon with the mild irritation of a man who has been interrupted in his thinking. It was a solid farm wagon, the kind built for hauling rather than comfort, loaded with lumber and canvas sacks, and what appeared to be a small cast iron stove. One of the rear wheels had shed a spoke and cracked at the rim, and the wagon had tilted at a decided angle that made it clear it was going nowhere without assistance. Standing beside the wheel with her hands on her hips and an expression of calm, deliberate problem-solving on her face, was a woman of perhaps 25 years, wearing a practical brown dress with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and a wide-brimmed hat pushed back on her head in a way that suggested she had been working and had pushed it back to see better. Her hair was dark brown and pinned up in the kind of arrangement that had begun the day neat and had since had the better part of a conversation with the wind. She was not beautiful in the way that paintings were beautiful, with their careful softness and studied symmetry. She was beautiful in the way that good tools were beautiful, in the way that a well-made rifle or a horse bred for endurance was beautiful, because everything about her served its purpose and served it well, and there was not a single wasted line in her. She looked up when he stopped, and her expression shifted from problem-solving to the particular kind of assessment that the territory reserved for strangers. "Wheel gave out," she said, without preamble or embarrassment. It was a statement of fact, not a complaint or an appeal. "I can see that," Phineas said. He swung down from Franklin and tied the reins loosely to the wagon's side rail. "Phineas Carson, I'm a lawyer in redemption." "Susanna Grayson," she said, and she extended her hand as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and he shook it, and it was the hand of someone who worked, calloused at the palm and strong in the grip. "I know who you are. You handled the survey dispute for the Clarks last fall." "I did," he said, somewhat surprised that she knew it. "Did you have an interest in that dispute?" "Neighboring property," she said. "The Clarks' eastern fence line runs near my north pasture. I needed to know whether it would hold up." "It held up," he said. "I know it did," she said. "I read the resolution." She looked back at the wheel with the same practical attention. "I have a spare rim iron and the tools, but the load needs to come off before I can jack it up, and I was working out the physics of doing that alone." Phineas looked at the wagon, looked at the load, looked at Susanna Grayson, and understood without her saying so that she was perfectly capable of working out those physics and executing them, but that a second pair of hands would speed the process considerably, and that she would accept help on the terms of it being practical rather than gallant. "Tell me what you need moved first," he said. She told him, and they worked. It took them the better part of an hour. The lumber came down first in stacks that he carried and she directed, and then the canvas sacks which held flour and dried beans and seed corn by their weight. And then, with considerable combined effort, the cast iron stove which neither of them made any jokes about because it was simply heavy and required their full attention. She jacked the axle with a practiced efficiency that told him she had done this before or something like it, and when the wheel was free, she examined the damage with the focus of a doctor assessing a wound. "The rim can be reshaped and the spoke replaced," she said. "The wood of the rim itself is sound." "This is not a catastrophe." "That is a good word for it," he said. He was sitting on one of the stacks of lumber and had removed his coat, because the April sun was warmer than Philadelphia had led him to expect from spring, and the wool coat was not built for this kind of work. "May I ask how far you are going?" "My property is about 2 miles further on," she said. "I have a ranch, 40 acres under cultivation and another 60 in grazing. I am expanding the eastern barn." She gestured at the lumber with the jack handle. "That is the reason for the load. You are building it yourself." She looked at him with an expression that was not offended but was measuring. "My hired hand Eli Bright helps, and my neighbor Thomas Calder's 2 boys come on Saturdays, but mostly yes." Phineas looked at the stove. "That stove was going into the barn, into the tack room attached to it," she said, "for the winter. The horses do better when the space is heated." She paused, setting the jack handle down and taking a long drink from a canteen she had hung from the wagon seat. She offered it to him without asking whether he wanted it, which he did, because the work had been real work. He drank and handed it back, and they sat for a moment in the comfortable silence of people who have done a thing together and are resting before doing the next part. The cottonwoods murmured along the creek nearby. A hawk turned slow circles high above in the blue sky. "You are the lawyer from Philadelphia," she said, not unkindly. "The one that Thomas Aldrich brought out." "Yes, "I am sorry about Thomas," she said, and she meant it. He could tell from the way her voice settled when she said it. "He was a good man and the territory needed more of them." "He was my closest friend from university," Phineas said. "His death was a considerable blow. Are you staying?" she asked, not in the way that people in town asked it, with the slightly judgmental edge of whether he was tough enough or whether he found them interesting enough. She asked it the way she had asked about the wheel, as a practical question that required an honest answer. "I have 30 days to decide," he said, and he did not know why he told her that, except that she had asked directly and she had strong hands from real work, and she had not introduced herself by asking whether she looked a fright from pushing lumber around in the morning heat. "My father has given me an ultimatum. Come home to the firm by June or forfeit the partnership arrangement." Susanna Grayson looked at him for a long moment, and there was something in her expression that he could not entirely read, something that was neither pity nor judgment but was perhaps recognition, the look of someone who had themselves faced choices between the easy thing and the true thing. "Then you have 30 days to pay attention," she said. They got the wheel back on together, using the spare iron she had brought and the tools from her kit, which were well maintained and properly organized in a canvas roll. He helped her reload the wagon, the stove going back on last and requiring all the ingenuity both of them possessed and the full use of a plank as a ramp, and when it was done, they were both breathing hard and the afternoon was settling into the gold-lit period between midday and evening. "Can I offer you water and something to eat?" she said. "My place is not far and you have given me 2 hours of your afternoon." "I was taking a deed transfer to the Mallorys," he said. "That can wait a day." "The Mallorys will not mind," she said, with the certainty of someone who knew the Mallorys. "Come and eat." He tied Franklin to the back of her wagon and rode with her on the wagon bench for the 2 miles to her property, and in those 2 miles something changed in the internal geography of the day. He did not notice it changing. He only noticed later that it had been different. Susanna Grayson's ranch sat in a wide, shallow bowl of land where the ground was rich and dark, and the grass was thick, and the cottonwoods were older and taller than the ones along the road. The house was not large, but it was well built and well kept, with a kitchen garden that ran along the south wall and was already showing the bright green of spring onions and early lettuce, and a barn that was older and sound, and the skeleton of the new eastern barn addition rising from raw new lumber on the other side of the yard. There was a vegetable cellar and a chicken coop and a smokehouse, and in the near pasture, 6 horses and a number of cattle that moved with the slow purposefulness of animals that are well managed and know it. "This is a serious operation," Phineas said, and he meant it with full respect. "It took me 4 years," she said, climbing down from the wagon with the ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "I came out here in 1874 with my husband, Raymond Grayson. He died in the winter of 1875. Influenza, very fast. I had the land and the first 2 horses and enough stubbornness to be dangerous, and I built the rest." "I am sorry for your loss," he said, and he meant that too. "Thank you," she said, simply and without the performance of grief, which told him the grief was real and settled and hers, not something she needed to display. "Raymond was a good man and I loved him, but life continues and the land needs tending." She made a meal that was practical and good, beef stew with cornbread, from a stove in the kitchen that was clearly the command center of the house, and they sat at the kitchen table while Eli Bright, her hired hand, came in from the field and nodded at Phineas with the neutral assessment of a man who works hard and respects those who do the same. Eli was a lean man in his late 40s with a quiet face and the kind of efficiency of movement that came from decades of hard physical work. He ate quickly and excused himself to finish what he had been doing, and Phineas and Susanna sat with the remains of the meal and the late afternoon light coming through the kitchen window. "What kind of law do you practice?" she asked. "Land and contracts primarily," he said. "Wills and deeds. I have done some criminal defense, but the territory has a circuit judge and most of the criminal work goes to him. I am perhaps the only formally trained lawyer between Redemption and Santa Fe who is not affiliated with the land speculators." Something sharpened in her expression. "The speculators have lawyers. They have one in particular," he said. "A man named Roland Vance, who operates out of Santa Fe and who has been, in my professional opinion, doing creative things with territorial land grants that would not survive serious scrutiny in a federal court." Susanna was quiet for a moment, and he could see her weighing something. Then she said, "I have a neighbor 2 miles east named Clement Barrow. He and his wife have farmed their land for 6 years. Last month they received a notice claiming that a portion of their original homestead grant overlapped with a land grant held by a company called Mesa Verde Land and Cattle, which I happen to know is a shell company operated by a man named Harrington who came out from Denver 2 years ago and has been acquiring properties in this valley by methods that would not pass a straight-faced explanation." Phineas set down his coffee cup and gave her his full attention. "What kind of methods?" "Forged survey records," she said evenly. "Or so it appears. I cannot prove it because I am a rancher and not a lawyer, but the boundaries in Harrington's grants do not match the original territorial survey records from 1870, which I happen to have seen because I researched my own property extensively when Raymond died, and I needed to understand everything I owned and was responsible for." Phineas looked at this woman across the kitchen table in the late afternoon light, and felt something he had not felt in quite some time, which was the specific kind of interest that arose when a genuinely important problem presented itself to someone with the skills to address it. He had been spending months writing wills for men whose primary estate was a horse and drafting contracts for livestock trades. Here was something real. The original territorial survey records would be held at the land office in Santa Fe, he said, and copies should exist at the county seat in Las Cruces. If the discrepancies you describe are there in the records, a formal complaint to the General Land Office in Washington could trigger an investigation. But it would need to be documented carefully, with survey comparisons and witness statements, and it would take someone who understood federal land law. "Do you understand federal land law?" she asked. "I studied it at the University of Pennsylvania," he said. "I have read the Homestead Act, the Desert Land Act, and the preemption statutes with a completeness that my professor described as excessive." Susanna Grayson looked at him across the table with something that was neither admiration nor judgment, but was something that felt like recognition, the same quality she had brought to the moment on the road. This woman who measured everything by whether it worked and what it was worth, and whether it was honest. "Then perhaps redemption has a use for you after all," she said, and it was not flattery. It was a working assessment offered straight. Phineas rode back toward town in the evening with the deed transfer to the Mallorys still undelivered, and the telegram from his father still in his breast pocket, and something new sitting in his chest that was different from the vague restlessness and half-made purpose he had been carrying for 8 months. It was not large or loud. It was quiet and pointed, like a compass needle finding north after a long confusion. He thought about a woman who had jacked up a wagon wheel with the same calm efficiency with which she had described land fraud, and who had offered him water before she had offered him conversation, and who had said 30 days to pay attention, as if it were the most obvious and useful advice in the world. He thought about it a great deal. The following morning, he went to the land office in Redemption, which was run by a man named Gerald Post, and he requested access to the survey maps filed for the Eastern Valley properties. Gerald Post was a round, careful man who kept meticulous records, and who was, Phineas had observed, somewhat nervous about the increased attention being paid to property in the valley since Harrington had arrived from Denver. "I am making some general inquiries on behalf of several clients regarding the accuracy of recent survey filings," Phineas said, which was approximately true. Gerald Post produced the maps with the efficiency of a man who had been asked the same questions several times recently, and was perhaps relieved to have someone formally engaged with the problem. Phineas spent the morning with the maps spread on the wide table in the back of the land office, and a growing sense of focused clarity that he had not felt since his best days in law school. The discrepancies were real, and they were significant. In 3 separate cases, the boundaries described in the Mesa Verde land and cattle grants overlapped with the original homestead filings by amounts that could not be attributed to surveying error. Surveying error was a known quantity in the territory, and honest errors ran to a few feet at the boundary, not to the 40 or 80, or in one case, 120 acres that these overlaps represented. Someone had drawn these grants on maps that predated the homesteaders, and had then submitted them as valid without disclosing the conflict. In a territory with no established federal court and a land office that was understaffed and under pressure, it had worked, at least so far. He made careful copies of the relevant survey sections and noted the filing dates and identification numbers of both the Mesa Verde grants and the original homestead filings. Then he went to his room above the hardware store and wrote a carefully organized letter to the General Land Office in Washington documenting the discrepancies, and another to the Office of the United States Attorney for the Territory of New Mexico. Then he rode out to Susanna Grayson's ranch. She was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, turning compost into the beds with the purposeful rhythm of someone who knows the soil and treats it accordingly. She looked up when she heard Franklin in the yard, and she straightened and brushed her hands on her apron and came to the garden gate. He told her what he had found. She listened without interrupting, which was a quality he was already learning to value in her, the ability to receive information completely before responding to it. When he finished, she said, "The Barrow family needs to know this, and the 2 other families you mentioned. They need to understand that there is a formal process that can protect them. I would like to visit them with you," he said, "if you would be willing to make the introductions. They know you. They do not know me." "I will do that," she said. "Come Sunday, I will arrange for the Barrows and the Hendrys and the Wattses to come here after church." He nodded. Then he said, "I would also like to come before Sunday if that is acceptable." She looked at him with those steady dark eyes that did not miss much. "Is there more you need to see regarding the land matter?" "No," he said honestly. "I would simply like to come." There was a pause in which the garden and the mild afternoon and the distant sound of Eli Bright working on the new barn all held their breath together. "Thursday," she said, "I am mending fences in the north pasture. An extra pair of hands is useful. I will be here at 8, he said. He was there at 7:50, and she was already in the pasture with the wire stretcher and the fencing pliers, and they worked alongside each other all morning in the comfortable rhythm that they had found the first afternoon on the road, communicating mostly in practical shorthand and the occasional observation about the work itself. And somehow in all of that practicality, there was something else happening that neither of them named. At noon they ate at the fence line, bread and cold beef and apples, sitting on the grass with the north pasture stretching away in the spring sunlight and the mountains visible above the far ridge. Susanna told him about coming to the territory with Raymond in 1874, about the first brutal winter and learning to read weather in a sky that was different from the eastern sky she had grown up under in Virginia. He told her about Philadelphia and the law firm and his father, who was a good man and a demanding one, and who loved him in the way that men of that generation loved their sons, with high expectations dressed as affection. "Do you want to go back?" she asked. Not unkindly, but directly, as was her way. "I did not want to come," he said. "Thomas convinced me that there was something worth doing out here. And then Thomas died and I was already here and I did not know whether to stay or go, and every day I made a reason to put the decision off, and then my father made the decision for me with his telegram." "But you stayed 8 months," she said. "That is not nothing. That is obligation and inertia," he said. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe it is the territory waiting for you to pay attention, as I told you." He looked at her. She was looking out at the pasture where her horses moved in the afternoon light. her elbows on her knees and her hat on the grass beside her, and her hair was coming down on one side from the morning's work, a dark curl against her cheek, and she was completely herself, entirely at ease in the world she had built. And Phineas Carson felt something break open in his chest with the kind of quiet violence of a flower opening, which he recognized even then as an inadequate metaphor, but which was the closest thing he had. He looked away before she could see it, because it was too large and too new, and he was a careful man by training if not always by temperament. Sunday came, and the families gathered at Susanna's kitchen, which was not large enough for 6 adults and several children who sat outside in the yard, while their parents sat inside with the worried faces of people who have worked hard for something and have recently been told it may be taken from them. The Barrows were a quiet couple in their 40s, Clement with big work-worn hands and his wife Hannah, who kept straightening things that did not need straightening. The Hendrys were younger, a man named Frank and his wife Clara, who had 2 small boys currently engaged in a competition in the yard involving a stick and a fence post. The Wattses were older than all of them. Amos Watts, who had come to the territory from Missouri in the 1860s, and his wife Eleanor, who had the serene quality of someone who has survived enough difficulty that the present one is simply the current version of a familiar test. Phineas laid out what he had found in clear and careful language, and he answered their questions. And when Clement Barrow asked what this would actually mean in practice, Phineas told him that it would mean a federal investigation that could take several months, and that in the meantime he would file a formal objection with the land office to halt any enforcement action on the disputed grants. He did not promise outcomes he could not guarantee, because he was a careful man and because these people deserved honesty. "What does this cost us?" Frank Hendry asked, and there was a dignity in the asking of it that acknowledged the reality of his situation without embarrassment. Phineas thought about the telegram in his breast pocket. He thought about the 30 days and the firm in Philadelphia. He thought about what the territory had been and what it could be, and about 3 families sitting in a kitchen with worried hands and steady eyes. "Nothing," he said. "Consider it a service to the community." He could feel Susanna watching him from across the kitchen table, and he did not look at her. After the families had gone, she walked him to where Franklin was tied, and the evening was coming in gold and soft over the mesa, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "That was a generous thing," she said. "It was a right thing," he said. "There is a difference." "There is," she agreed, "but they are not mutually exclusive." He mounted Franklin and looked down at her from the saddle, and the evening light was in her hair and on her face, and she was looking up at him with those eyes that saw clearly and missed nothing. "I will file the formal objection tomorrow," he said. "I know you will," she said. He rode home in the dark with the stars enormous overhead, and he thought about her saying, "I know you will," with the simple certainty of a woman who had assessed him and found him to be what he appeared to be, and that was a thing he had not known he needed until he had it. He filed the objection on Monday morning. On Tuesday, he received a letter from a man named Mr. Harrington, delivered by a courier to his office above the hardware store, which stated in careful and civil language that the claims in question were legally sound, and that any interference with them would be met with corresponding legal action. It was a well-drafted letter, and Phineas read it twice with professional appreciation for its construction, and then he drafted a response that was equally civil and considerably more precise in its references to the specific statutes under which the General Land Office investigations were authorized, and sent it back. On Wednesday, he rode out to Susanna's ranch to tell her about the exchange. She read both letters at the kitchen table and set them down with the flat expression of a woman containing something that was moving faster inside her than it appeared on the surface. "He is going to fight this," she said. "He will," Phineas agreed. "His investment in these properties is substantial. He will not give them up without a contest, but the contest will happen in front of a federal judge, and the documentary evidence is clear. The question is whether the investigation moves fast enough, and if the Barrows or the Hendrys get eviction notices before the investigation resolves. Then I go to Judge Henderson on the circuit and get an injunction, he said. It is a slower wheel than we would like, but it turns in the right direction. Susanna stood up and went to the kitchen window that looked out over her yard, where the new barn addition was rising steadily from its lumber skeleton, taking the shape of something permanent. When Raymond died, she said, the one thing I was most afraid of was that someone would try to take the land. Not because I thought it was likely, but because I had seen it happen to others, women who lost their husbands and then lost their property because they did not have the knowledge or the legal standing to protect it. I spent 2 years reading everything I could find. Every territorial statute, every Homestead Act provision, every ruling from the land office. That is why you had the original survey records, he said. That is why, she said, and why I knew immediately what Harrington was doing when the Barrows told me about their notice. She turned from the window and looked at him. I am glad you are here, Phineas Carson. It was said simply and practically as she said most things, but it landed in him with a weight that simple sentences sometimes carry, a weight disproportionate to their size. I am beginning to be glad of it myself, he said, and it was the most honest thing he had said to himself or to anyone in quite some time. He stayed for supper again. He had been staying for supper more often than not since the first Thursday, and Eli Bright had begun setting a third place at the table without being asked, which was a kind of commentary Phineas appreciated for its quiet accuracy. That evening after supper, Susanna showed him the vegetable cellar, which he had not seen, because she wanted to show him the record-keeping system she had built to track the yield from each section of the kitchen garden and the larger field plots. It was an impressive and meticulous system, organized in a way that would have suited an accountant, with careful notations about soil amendments and planting dates, and the weather at each stage. This is remarkable, he said, and he meant it in the way that he had meant the ranch was a serious operation, with the full weight of professional appreciation for something done with skill. It needs to be, she said. I cannot afford to learn the same lesson twice. The first year I lost a third of my corn crop to poor timing on the planting, and that was a winter that required very careful management. After that, I wrote everything down. They were standing in the cellar with the lamp between them, and the light from the lamp made everything warm and close, and she was standing near enough that he could smell the wood smoke and the sage that were in her hair, and he became suddenly aware that he was very aware of her, which was not a new awareness but which was, at this particular proximity, more vivid. He stepped back and said something sensible about the organization of the shelves, and she agreed with his sensible comment, and they went back upstairs, and he stayed another half-hour over coffee, and then rode home under the same enormous stars with the distinct impression that he was not managing himself with any particular skill. The weeks passed with the rhythm of the territory, which was different from the rhythm of a city, and which Phineas was learning to read the way Susanna said she had learned to read the sky, as a language that required attention and patience. He filed the formal complaints with the General Land Office and the United States Attorney's Office. He continued his regular work in redemption, and he found that the Barrow and Hendry and Watts situation had become known in the valley in the way that things became known in small communities, without announcement, and with the thoroughness of water finding its level, and that his willingness to take it on without fee had changed the way people in redemption looked at him. Gerald Post at the land office was more forthcoming with records. The barkeep at the Dusty Spur, a man named Pete Hollies, who was also the unofficial clearinghouse for all information in the valley, began greeting him by name with genuine warmth. The Mallorys, when he finally delivered their deed transfer with an apology for the delay, insisted on feeding him dinner and introduced him to their daughter and their son-in-law and their 3 grandchildren. And by the time he left their ranch, he had been invited to Sunday dinners for the next month. and he rode out to Susanna's ranch 2 or 3 times a week, for reasons that had begun with the land case and had become something that the land case no longer fully explained. On the 14th day after the telegram, he helped her and Eli Bright raise the frame for the east wall of the new barn addition, a day of hard physical work that required all three of them working in close coordination and left all three of them tired and satisfied in the bone-deep way that comes from real accomplishment. When the wall was up and braced, they stood back and looked at it, the clean new lumber golden in the afternoon light, and Susanna put her hands on her hips and looked at what they had done, and she was smiling, really smiling, in a way he had not yet seen, which was different from her usual expression of calm engagement, which was open and warm and completely without reservation. He thought it was one of the most beautiful things he had seen in the territory, which was saying something. "We will celebrate with supper," she said, "and I believe, Eli, you deserve the evening off." Eli Bright looked between them with the composed neutrality of a man who is perceptive and discreet in equal measure, and said he thought he would take a walk down to the creek, and left with a timing that Phineas suspected was not accidental. They made supper together in the kitchen, which had not happened before. She told him what to do, and he did it, and she was patient with his considerable inexperience in the domestic arts, and they talked continuously about everything except what was happening between them, which was proceeding along its own trajectory with the same quiet inevitability as the barn wall that was now standing in the yard outside. After supper they sat on the front porch in the warm spring evening with coffee, and the valley was full of the sounds of night beginning, the cicadas and the distant coyotes and the horses moving in the pasture with their soft, heavy sounds, and the sky was darkening from gold to orange to a deep, clear violet. "My husband proposed to me on a porch not unlike this one," Susanna said. "We were in Virginia. It was summer. He was very formal about it, very prepared. He had written out what he wanted to say." She smiled at the memory, not sadly, but with the gentle affection of something that is past and good. "He was a wonderful man in many ways and entirely unsuited to improvising." "Were you surprised?" "No," she said. "I had known he was going to ask for some time. I was waiting for him to notice that I already knew." Phineas looked at his coffee cup. "You are a patient woman," he said. "I am a practical one," she said. "Patient is different." A pause. "I have 2 weeks left on my father's deadline," he said. She did not say anything for a moment, looking out at the valley. Then she said, "What does the territory need to be for you to stay in it?" "I think," he said slowly, choosing each word with care, "that it needs to be somewhere I am doing something real. Not just managing the small commerce of a small town, but doing the kind of work that matters. The kind that protects people who cannot protect themselves." "The land case," she said. "Yes," he said, "and other cases like it. The territory is growing, and the growth is not always honest, and there are families out here who have everything they own invested in this land, and they are vulnerable to men like Harrington who have money and connections, and the patience to work through legal channels that most people do not understand." "That sounds like a reason to stay," she said. "It is a professional reason," he said. Another pause, and this one had a different quality. "Phineas," she said, and she said it with the directness that was the essential quality of her character, "I have been thinking for some time about whether to say something to you that is somewhat out of the ordinary, and I have decided that not saying it would be less honest than saying it, and I value honesty more than I value the usual social arrangements." He turned to look at her. She was looking at him with those clear, steady eyes. "I would like you to stay in the territory," she said. "Not only for the land case, and not only for the valley, though both of those are real. I would like you to stay because in 2 weeks I have learned that you are a man of unusual integrity and genuine competence, and a quality of attention that I find more valuable than I know how to say precisely, and I am not a woman who misses what is good when she sees it, because I have had the grief of losing it, and I know the difference between the presence and the absence of a thing." The valley was very quiet. The last of the violet sky was going to black, and the stars were beginning. Phineas Carson looked at Susanna Grayson on her porch in the territory of New Mexico in the spring of 1878, and he understood something about the nature of arriving. He had spent 8 months in redemption feeling like a man who had arrived somewhere he had not intended to be. He understood now, sitting on this porch, that the location was less about intention than about recognition, that arriving somewhere was not the same as belonging somewhere, and that belonging was not something a place did to you, but something a person did for you, or sometimes alongside you, in the slow building of attention that was what he and this woman had been doing since an April morning on a road with a broken wagon wheel. "I want to say something to you in return," he said, "and I want to say it carefully because it is important and I do not want to be careless with it." She was watching him. "I have been telling myself that I have not yet decided whether this territory is where I belong," he said. "And that has been true, in the sense that I had not made a formal decision and announced it to myself with conviction. But I think the honest truth is that I decided on that first afternoon on the road when you handed me a canteen before you asked me my name, and then told me I had 30 days to pay attention, and then got back to work. I think that was the moment the decision was made, and I was simply the last one to be informed of it." Susanna Grayson looked at him for a long moment, and then she laughed, which was not something he had heard her do fully before, and it was a genuine and uncalculated laugh, warm and real, and she said, "You are surprisingly well put together for a man in a wool coat in April." "The coat is a failing," he agreed. "I am told it makes me look like I arrived somewhere I did not intend to be." "You have arrived somewhere you very much were intended to be," she said, and she reached across the small space between their chairs and put her hand over his, which was warm and certain and practical, exactly like her, and they sat like that while the stars came in fully overhead and the valley settled into its night sounds, and it was one of the best evenings of his life. He wrote to his father the following morning. He wrote it carefully, as he wrote everything, but he also wrote it with a conviction that was new in him, clean and without apology. He told his father that he had found his direction in the territory, that there was real and important legal work to be done, and that he was building something in redemption that he intended to build for the rest of his career. He told him about the land fraud case, about the 3 families, about the documents he had filed with the federal authorities. He told him that he hoped his father would understand, and that he wished the firm well, and that he was grateful for the education and the foundation that had made this possible. He did not tell his father about Susanna Grayson, because some things did not belong in letters, and because what he felt was large and new, and not yet in words of the kind you put in letters. He sent the letter with the Tuesday stage. Then he rode to the Barrow Ranch with copies of all his filings and sat with Clement and Hannah Barrow and explained exactly where things stood. And on his way back through town, he stopped at Horace Webb's general store and bought a new hat, a proper territory hat with a wide brim, because his wool coat had been remarked upon enough, and there was a limit to how long a man could be a visitor in his own life. Horace Webb, who was a cheerful man of 50 with a remarkable mustache, looked at the hat Phineas chose and then looked at Phineas and said, "You look like you're staying." "I am," Phineas said. "Good," said Horace Webb. "We could use the law." He was wearing the hat when he rode out to Susanna's ranch that afternoon, and she looked at it when he rode into the yard, and she said, without expression but with the light in her eyes that he was learning to read, "Improvement." "I have decided to take the territory seriously," he said. "The territory appreciates it," she said. He dismounted, and she took his horse to the water trough and he walked beside her, and the afternoon was warm and the new barn wall was still standing, and the garden was showing more green than it had 2 weeks ago, and everything had a quality of rightness that was new and which he suspected was going to continue to deepen. On the 18th day after the telegram, a man rode into Redemption from the direction of Santa Fe. His name, as he introduced himself at Phineas's office, was Deputy Marshal Cornelius Webb, no relation to Horace, a lean and weathered man in his 50s with a silver badge, and the economy of expression that characterized men who had been doing serious work in serious places for a long time. He had received the complaint forwarded by the United States Attorney's Office and had come to look at the documentary evidence. Phineas spent 3 hours with Deputy Marshal Webb, spreading the survey maps and the filing records on the table in his office, which was now properly organized for the first time since he had occupied it, because purpose had a clarifying effect on tidiness. Webb listened, asked questions that were specific and well-framed, and took detailed notes. At the end of the meeting, Webb said, "You have done thorough work, Counselor. I will be looking into Mesa Verde land and cattle and their principles with some attention. There are 3 families in this valley whose homestead claims are at risk," Phineas said. "I would appreciate knowing the timeline on the investigation so I can advise them accordingly." "I appreciate your concern for the citizens," Webb said, and he said it in a way that suggested he genuinely did. "I will be in contact." After he left, Phineas sat in his office for a long moment and then went to the Dusty Spur for a coffee, because Pete Holly's made excellent coffee, and because he needed to sit with the feeling that things were moving in the right direction. Pete Holly's, who had a way of reading the room, put the coffee in front of him and said, "Word is there's a federal marshal asking questions about Harrington." "Word travels fast in redemption," Phineas said. "Word travels at the speed of necessity in redemption," Pete said. "People are glad." Phineas thought about Clement Barrow's hands on the table in the kitchen on that Sunday, and about Eleanor Watts, who had the serenity of a woman who had survived enough difficulty, and he felt that specific satisfaction of work that was connected to real things rather than abstraction. That evening he rode to Susanna's and told her about Webb, and she listened with the same focused attention she brought to everything, and when he finished she said, "That is very good news." "It is progress," he said carefully. "It is not resolution yet. You are careful with your words," she said. "A professional habit," he said. "It is a good one," she said. "Careless words do a great deal of damage." They were in the kitchen and she was making coffee, and he was sitting at the table that had become, in 18 days, as familiar a place as anywhere he had been, more familiar in some ways than his room above the hardware store. He watched her move around the kitchen with the efficiency and ease that was native to her, and he thought about what it would be to have this kitchen and this table and this woman in them as a permanent geography of his life, rather than a place he rode to and rode away from, and the thought was so large and clear that he set it down carefully in his mind the way you set down something fragile and important. "Susanna," he said. She turned from the stove. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "With your knowledge and your agreement, I am not a man who is comfortable with ambiguity in matters that are important, and this is important." She set down the coffee pot and looked at him with those steady, clear eyes, and she was very still for a moment, and then she said, "I would like that, Phineas." "Yes." "Good," he said. She nodded once, as if something practical had been decided, and then she smiled, which he was collecting the way you collect evidence of something valuable, and she turned back to the coffee. They spent the subsequent days in the sustained and increasingly vivid way of 2 people who have acknowledged what is happening between them and are proceeding with care and attention, and the particular joy of building something that is going to last. He brought her books from the small collection in his room, ones he thought she would find useful or engaging, which she read with the same thoroughness she brought to territorial statutes, marking passages with small, precise notations in the margins. She showed him the full extent of her property, walking him through each section with the pride and the knowledge of a woman who had earned her understanding of the land through years of direct attention to it. She showed him the north section where the soil was thinner and required different management, and the creek bottom where the willows grew, and where she had observed beaver working for the past 2 springs, and the high meadow above the eastern pasture where the grass came in late and thick, and was the best grazing on the property. She knew the land the way a scholar knew a text, at the level of detail that comes from loving something enough to keep looking at it. He told her about Philadelphia, about the way the city moved and sounded in ways that were very different from this, about his mother who had died when he was 12, and who had been, by all accounts, a woman of considerable character who had loved the law and had been unable to practice it because women could not be admitted to the bar, and who had encouraged her son's legal education with a fervor that he understood better now, from the territory, than he had as a boy. "She sounds remarkable," Susanna said when he told her this. "She was," he said. "I think she would have been good at this kind of work, the frontier cases, the things that actually matter to actual people." "I think you are good at it," she said. "I am becoming good at it," he said. "There is a difference. You are very hard on yourself," she observed. "I am honest about myself," he said. "There is a difference." She gave him the slight smile that acknowledged a point fairly made, and they rode on through the high meadow in the morning sun. On the 22nd day after the telegram, Deputy Marshal Webb arrested a man in Santa Fe by the name of Victor Crane, who was the primary surveyor employed by Mesa Verde Land and Cattle, and who, facing a federal charge of submitting false survey records, had elected to provide a comprehensive account of the operation in exchange for consideration from the prosecutor. Phineas heard about this from Pete Hollis, who had heard it from a stage driver who had come through from Santa Fe, and he rode immediately to tell the Barrows and the Hendrys and the Wattses. Hannah Barrow cried when he told her. Not dramatically, just 2 or 3 tears that she brushed away quickly with the back of her hand, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Carson, thank you." Clement shook his hand for a long time without saying anything, and then he said, "You are a good man," and it was the simplest and most complete compliment Phineas had received in years. He told Susanna that evening on her porch, and she took the news with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen the problem and identified the solution, and had the patience to wait for it to work. "It is not fully finished," he said. "The legal proceedings against Harrington and his associates will take time, and there may be complications. But the injunction will hold, and the Barrows and the others are protected while the federal process runs its course. You will see it through," she said. "Every bit of it," he said. She looked at him, and the evening was warm, and he was sitting on the porch of a ranch that had been built by this woman's hands and heart and stubbornness, and she was looking at him with those eyes that were very specific in their attention, and he reached across the space between them, as she had done 2 weeks earlier, and took her hand. "I wrote to my father that I am staying," he said. "When?" 18 days ago, he said. "On the morning after we sat here and you told me what I had been unable to tell myself." She was quiet, but her hand was warm in his. "I want to talk to you about something," he said, "and I want to be careful with the timing because the timing matters, and I do not want to do this before I have earned the right to it." "You have earned it," she said quietly. He looked at her. "You know what I am going to say." "I have been knowing it," she said, "for some time." "I was waiting for you to notice that I already knew." He recognized the words. She was smiling very slightly, and her eyes were warm and clear and full of something that was not complicated at all. And he laughed, which surprised him, a real and full laugh, and she laughed too, and the valley and the stars and the sage-scented air held both of them in the good evening. "Susanna Grayson," he said, "I have spent 8 months in this territory trying to understand whether I belong in it, and I have understood for some time that the answer is yes. But I have understood for a shorter time that the reason the answer is yes is sitting next to me on this porch. You are the most honest, most capable, most genuinely remarkable person I have encountered in my life, and I love you with a completeness that I did not know I was capable of when I arrived here. I would like to ask you to marry me if you are willing, and I would like to build a life in this valley with you that is as good and as real as the things you have already built." There was a moment, a long one, in which the evening was very beautiful. "Yes," she said, "I am willing. I have been willing since about the 3rd Thursday, if you want the truth." "You are wonderfully direct," he said. "I am practical," she said. "You know the difference." He did. He leaned toward her and kissed her for the first time, and it was exactly as he had imagined it would be, which was warm and honest and full, and she kissed him back with the same quality of full attention that she brought to everything she did, and the horses moved in the pasture and the stars were enormous, and the territory was entirely, perfectly real. He received a letter from his father on the 28th day after the telegram, which arrived by the Thursday stage. His father's letter was not long, but it was, to Phineas's surprise and deep gratitude, thoughtful. His father wrote that he had read the account of the land fraud case with considerable professional interest, and that the federal filing strategy was well constructed. He wrote that he understood that a man must find his own direction, and that he trusted his son's judgment, even when that judgment led the son somewhere the father had not expected. He wrote that the firm would find its way, and that the partnership arrangement would always be there if circumstances changed, but that it would not be conditional on returning east. At the very end, in a slightly different hand, as if written at a separate sitting, he had added a line, "I believe your mother would have approved of the territory." Phineas read that line 3 times and then folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket alongside the original telegram, which was still there, 30 days later. He rode to Susanna's ranch on the 30th day, the last day of his father's original deadline, and he arrived in the morning, and they spent the day together doing the ordinary work of the ranch, which was never entirely ordinary because ordinary work done by people in love has a different quality from ordinary work done alone. They repaired a section of the south fence and oiled the tack in the tack room, which smelled of leather and horse, and the first hints of iron from the stove that was now properly installed and beginning to season. They went over the planting schedule for the second half of May, because the territory had taught Susanna to plan ahead with ruthless optimism, planting as if the weather would cooperate and preparing as if it might not. Eli Bright knocked off early, citing personal business that Phineas suspected was as strategically motivated as his creek walk several weeks before, and they were alone in the kitchen in the late afternoon when Phineas pulled the telegram from his breast pocket and read it once more and then laid it on the table between them. 30 days, he said. Susanna read it, the same 12 words in his father's economical hand. She set it down and looked at him. And, she said, "I am staying," he said. "I am completely, fully, with my whole self staying in this territory, in this valley, in this town, and I am going to build a practice that serves the people here as they deserve to be served, and I am going to marry you as soon as you will permit it, and I am going to live in the place where I belong." He paused. "That is my decision." Susanna Grayson looked at him across the kitchen table, in the kitchen she had built, and the house she had built, and on the land she had fought for, and her expression was the most open and unguarded he had seen it, which was saying something because she was not a guarded woman, but this was the openness of something fully resolved. "The permit is immediate," she said, "whenever you like." "The end of May," he said. "Is that enough time to arrange things? The preacher in Redemption married the Hendry boy last fall," she said. "He is experienced and pleasant about it. And Mrs. Aldrich, who runs the boarding house, is the best baker in the valley, and she will make a cake if asked properly." "Then the end of May," he said. They wrote the date in the kitchen calendar, May 28th, 1878, which was one of the official ways that things became real. The weeks between the decision and the wedding were full and bright and busy. The Barrow matter progressed well, with the federal investigation resulting in the formal invalidation of the 3 overlapping grants and the issuance of corrected titles to the affected homestead families. Harrington left the territory in early May without announcement, and Roland Vance, the Santa Fe lawyer, received a formal censure that would have ongoing professional consequences. The Valley knew about all of this, because the Valley always knew, and the knowing changed the way Redemption related to itself, gave it the particular satisfaction of a community that has been protected by its own resources. Phineas found himself busy in ways he had not been since he arrived. The 3 families he had represented sent others. New cases came in, land disputes and contract questions, and the ordinary commerce of a growing territory, handled by men and women who trusted the lawyer in the building above the hardware store, because he had demonstrated that he could be trusted. He moved his office to a proper ground-floor space on the main street, which he furnished simply but well, and which had a sign on the door that read Phineas Carson, attorney at law, which he had made by the local carpenter, and which he thought about every time he unlocked the door in the morning with a satisfaction that was quiet and durable. He moved out of the room above the hardware store and took a proper house at the edge of town, a modest but sound 2-story structure with a good kitchen and a parlor and 2 bedrooms, and a yard that had the potential for a kitchen garden if someone with Susanna's knowledge were to apply attention to it. He spent evenings getting it ready, painting the parlor and mending the back fence, and getting the kitchen stove properly cleaned and functional, because Susanna came by twice to assess the house, and both times she went through it with the practical eye of a woman who would be spending significant time there and who had standards. "The kitchen is acceptable," she said, on her second visit. "High praise," he said. "The back bedroom will need new curtains," she said. "The ones here are a ruin." "I defer to your judgment," he said. "You should," she said, but she was smiling. "The house has good bones." "That is what Thomas Aldrich said about the territory," he said. "Thomas was right about that," she said, even if he was optimistic about the timeline. They stood in the parlor of the house in town and looked at what could be made of it, and there was in that moment the pleasure of 2 people who are building something together, which is different from and greater than the pleasure of any single accomplishment. Mrs. Aldrich at the boarding house was delighted to be asked about the cake, as Susanna had predicted, and produced a plan of considerable ambition involving 3 layers and dried apricots from the previous fall's harvest, which she had been saving for an occasion worthy of them. The preacher, Reverend Caleb Morse, was in fact experienced and pleasant about the whole business, and the only wrinkle in the arrangements was that Phineas's father wrote to say he could not make the journey in time, which was true, and also was understood by Phineas to be as much about his father's need for the familiar as about distance, and he wrote back that he understood, and that he would be married with the family he had found in the territory and the one in Philadelphia in his heart. And his father wrote back that he was glad for his son's happiness, which was as much as anyone could reasonably ask. On May 28, 1878, with the cottonwoods in full leaf and the valley in the particular vivid green of late spring, Phineas Carson and Susanna Grayson were married in the white-painted church at the far end of Redemption's Main Street. The church was full. The Barrows were there, and the Hendrys with their 2 small boys who were imperfectly contained by the pew, and the Wattses with their serene dignity. Horace Webb was there from the general store, and Pete Hollies from the dusty spur, and Gerald Post from the land office, and Eli bright in a coat that was clearly new and clearly uncomfortable, and Cody from the livery stable, and Mrs. Aldrich and the Mallorys, and a dozen other people who had, in the compressed and honest time of a frontier community, become the particular kind of neighbor that was also something more. Deputy Marshal Cornelius Webb was in the territory on other business, and had come by Redemption specifically for the occasion, which Phineas thought said something about the man's character that was entirely consistent with his professional judgment. Susanna wore a dress that she had made herself, as she had made most things in her life, in a pale blue-gray that suited her dark hair and her direct eyes, and was nothing fussy or frivolous, just well-made and beautiful in the way that things she made were always beautiful. She wore flowers from her own kitchen garden, because she grew them as well as vegetables, because she understood that beauty was also something a person needed, and she walked down the aisle of the small church with the same quality of self-possession she brought to the pasture and the kitchen and the wagon bench, which was the quality of a woman who was entirely herself in every place she occupied. Phineas stood at the altar and watched her come toward him and understood, with the full weight of the territory and the sky and 8 months and 30 days and an afternoon on the road, that he was standing in the exact right place in the world, and that he had arrived there by the specific grace of paying attention. They exchanged vows that Reverend Morse had offered to write for them, and which they had instead written for themselves, which the Reverend had accepted with the equanimity of a man who had lived long enough to know when to step aside for something good. Susanna's vows were direct and clear and spoke about honesty and partnership, and the particular courage it took to love someone without reserve after you had learned the weight of loss. Phineas's vows were careful and complete, and said that he had come to the territory looking for direction, and had found the truest kind, which was not a direction toward something but a direction into something, into a life lived alongside a person whose honesty made him better and whose strength made him brave. Several people in the church found the occasion moving. Eli Bright did not cry. He was, however, seen to address the ceiling of the church with great attention for a period of approximately 45 seconds. Afterwards there was a celebration in the street, which was the territory's way, informal and generous, with food from a dozen households and music from 3 men who could play fiddles and 1 who could play a harmonica, and the afternoon stretched into a long golden evening, and Susanna danced, which Phineas had not known she could do, though he should have expected it because she was capable of most things she turned her attention to, and she danced with the same quality of full presence she brought to everything. And he danced with her, which he did adequately and with great pleasure. When the evening was done and the guests were gone and the fiddle players had packed up and ridden home, Phineas and Susanna walked together through Redemption to the house at the edge of town that was now their house, under the stars that were doing their reliable and enormous thing overhead, and she took his arm in the comfortable and certain way of a woman who has made a decision and is at peace with it. "Married," she said, in a tone that was its own kind of inventory. "Thoroughly," he said. "Good," she said. "I have some thoughts about the kitchen garden." "I was hoping you would," he said. She laughed and leaned against his arm, and they walked home. The kitchen garden went in the following weekend, because Susanna did not put off useful work, and she designed it with the same meticulous care she brought to the garden at the ranch, with sections for herbs and root vegetables and 1 corner specifically for the kind of flowers that could be cut and brought inside, because, as she said again while planting them, beauty was also something a person needed. The ranch continued to run, with Eli Bright as reliable and capable as ever and Susanna dividing her time between the property and the house in town, which was a practical arrangement they had discussed carefully and which suited them both, because Susanna's love for the land was not something that diminished with marriage but was part of what she was, and Phineas understood that and valued it. He rode out to the ranch 3 or 4 times a week, which kept him connected to the physical world of the valley in a way that he found essential to the practice of law there, because you could not truly serve a community without understanding its material reality. The practice grew. In the summer of 1878, he took on 2 cases that had significant implications for water rights in the valley, because the territory's growth was putting pressure on the streams and the aquifer, and the management of water was going to be the great legal question of the coming decades in the arid West. He wrote a brief that was eventually referenced by a federal judge in a water rights ruling, and the brief was noticed by the circuit judge and by the United States Attorney's Office, and by autumn there were inquiries about whether he might be willing to assist on other territorial cases of similar complexity. He handled them with the same thoroughness, the same care with documentation, the same respect for the people whose lives were affected by the outcomes, and the practice became something he was genuinely proud of, not in the way that a man is proud of an asset, but in the way that a craftsman is proud of work done honestly. In the evenings, in the house with the kitchen garden and the parlor he had painted himself, and the curtains that Susanna had made for the back bedroom, they were simply 2 people who were good for each other in all the ways that mattered, She read. He read. They talked about everything, the law and the land and the territory and the people in it, and the books they were reading and the ideas in them, and the way the sky changed with the seasons, and the way the creek ran differently in drought than in rain year. She taught him things about the land that he could not have learned from books, and he told her things about the law that she incorporated into her already formidable practical understanding of the statutes. They argued sometimes, because they were both people with opinions and the clarity to articulate them, and their arguments were the kind that end in resolution rather than damage, because both of them valued the argument more than they valued being right about it. In the fall of 1878, 6 months after their wedding, Susanna told him she was pregnant, on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen before he left for the office, as if it were a practical matter that required noting, which it was, though it was also considerably more than that. And he looked at her across the kitchen table and felt that flower-opening sensation again, that quiet internal seismic event, and he stood up and came around the table and put his arms around her, which she allowed with the warmth of a woman who is generally practical about things and occasionally agrees to be held. "Are you happy?" he asked, into her hair. "Thoroughly," she said, and she was using his word from their wedding night, and she knew it. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was a cold one, colder than the previous two, and the territory showed its less hospitable face, with ice on the creek and the kind of wind that came down from the mountains with serious intent. Susanna moved fully into the townhouse for the coldest months, with Eli Bright managing the ranch with the two Calder boys helping on the difficult days, and she presided over the winter with the same organized equanimity that she brought to everything, keeping the kitchen warm and the root cellar properly inventoried, and the household running on a schedule that had no wasted motion. Phineas had grown to love the territory in all its weathers. He had learned to read the sky the way Susanna had said he would, and he could tell now when a cold front was building over the mountains, and when the clouds over the mesa were the kind that dropped snow, and when they were the kind that merely threatened. He wore a proper territory coat now as well as the hat, a heavy canvas coat lined with sheepskin that he had bought from Horace Webb in November, and which transformed him, in Pete Holly's assessment, from a man who had arrived somewhere he had not intended to be into a man who very clearly intended to be exactly where he was. The baby came in May of 1879, which was almost exactly 1 year after the wedding, with the cottonwoods in leaf again and the spring green in the valley. It was a boy, which Phineas and Susanna had not known to expect, as knowing was not possible in those days, and he was robust and loud and entirely healthy, and they named him Thomas Raymond Carson, Thomas for the friend who had brought Phineas to the territory, and Raymond for the man who had brought Susanna to it, because both names were owed something. Eli Bright, informed of the birth by Phineas when he rode out to the ranch the following day, stood quietly for a moment and then said, "Thomas Raymond is a fine name." And that was the most sentiment Eli Bright had expressed about anything in the year and a half Phineas had known him, and it carried accordingly. The Barrow family sent a quilt that Hannah had been making since she heard about the pregnancy, which was a beautiful and useful object that Phineas regarded with the same appreciation he gave to well-made legal briefs. The Watts family sent preserved peaches from their orchard, because Eleanor Watts understood the value of practical gifts. The Hendry boys, who were now old enough to have opinions, sent a wooden horse carved by their father, which Thomas Raymond would not be able to use for several years, but which was nevertheless regarded by Phineas with the deep satisfaction of a man who is embedded in a community that knows him. Thomas was a vigorous and healthy child, who from his earliest weeks showed a particular interest in the world around him that both of his parents recognized as an echo of themselves, a focused and detailed attention to whatever was in front of him, whether that was the pattern on the kitchen ceiling or the sound of the horses in the yard, or, as he grew older, the survey maps that his father sometimes spread on the parlor floor, and the seed catalogs that his mother kept on the kitchen table. By the time Thomas was walking, he had opinions about several things, including the direction of the kitchen garden and the order in which the horses should receive their morning feed, the latter being Susanna's domain, but subject to revision by Thomas, based on criteria that were obscure to everyone but him. The practice continued to grow and deepen. In 1880, Phineas was asked by the circuit judge to serve as a court-appointed attorney for cases involving homesteaders whose rights were being challenged by the larger cattle interests that were moving into the territory with money and influence, and the casual conviction that the land was there for the taking. He said yes, because the cases were the same kind of case as the Barrow matter had been, only larger, and because the families he represented were the same kind of families, people who had come to the territory with nothing but their willingness to work and who deserved the law on their side. He argued several of these cases before the circuit judge in 1880 and 1881, and he won more than he lost, and the ones he lost he appealed with the thoroughness of a man who believed in the exhaustion of legal remedies, and some of those appeals succeeded. The work put him in front of the territory's legal establishment and the federal authorities on a regular basis, and his reputation expanded accordingly. Susanna expanded the ranch operation in 1880, adding a third pasture on the property to the north that she was able to acquire when its previous owner relocated to California, and she built the new barn addition that had been in her plans since before she met Phineas, completing it in the summer of 1880 with Eli Bright and the Calder boys, and on the final weekend of work, Phineas himself and Clement Barrow and Frank Hendry and Amos Watts, all of whom came with tools and without invitation, because that was the way the valley worked, and because Susanna Grayson Carson had gone to bat for all of them, and they understood the accounts that needed to be settled. The wall raising that weekend had the quality of a celebration even though it was work, with food in the middle of the day spread on boards across sawhorses in the yard, and Thomas Carson, aged 14 months, making his opinions known from a position on a blanket in the shade of the old barn, with the volume and conviction of a person who intends to be part of things regardless of his current limitations. In the spring of 1881, Susanna told him she was pregnant again, this time on a Sunday morning in the kitchen garden, while she was assessing the state of the spring onions, with the same matter-of-fact clarity as the first time. He had the same response, and she allowed it with the same warmth, and they stood in the kitchen garden in the spring morning, with Thomas investigating a beetle of some significance in the grass nearby. This time it was a girl, born in October 1881, with the cottonwoods turning gold and the first cold coming down from the mountains, and they named her Clara after Frank Hendry's wife, who had been a good friend to Susanna in the 4 years of their acquaintance, and who had always been ready with practical help and genuine kindness. Clara Carson arrived in the world with the same vigor as her brother, and a quality of focused observation that was immediately evident, looking at the world from her first hours with the attention of someone who intends to understand it thoroughly. Phineas wrote to his father when each child was born, and his father wrote back with the formal warmth of a man who had learned to express himself imperfectly but sincerely. And in the spring of 1882, his father actually made the journey, on the new railroad line that had reached the territory the previous year, arriving in Redemption on a Wednesday afternoon on the stage from the rail depot. Older than Phineas had expected to find him, and more moved than he showed, but genuinely moved nonetheless. The meeting between his father, Arthur Carson, a careful Philadelphia lawyer of 62, and Susanna Grayson Carson took place in the parlor of the house in Redemption on the afternoon of his arrival, with Thomas running between the furniture and Clara in Susanna's arms, and the kitchen sending in the smell of something good, and the territory visible through the window in the late afternoon gold. Arthur Carson looked at his son's wife for a long moment, and then he looked at his son, and then he looked at the house and the kitchen garden through the window and the children and the practice sign on the door of the office down the street that he had seen when the stage came in, and he said, with the economy of a man who had never been excessive with words, "Your mother was right." Phineas looked at him. "She said the right person would show him where he belonged," Arthur Carson said. "She said it years before you left. She knew you would need to leave to find it." Susanna shifted Clara in her arms and looked at the older man with her direct and unsentimentary eyes and said, "She sounds like a woman worth knowing." "She was," Arthur Carson said. "You would have gotten along." "I expect we would have," Susanna said. Arthur Carson stayed 3 weeks, which was longer than planned and was the result of the territory doing what it did to people who paid attention to it, which was to make them understand that it was real and particular, and not anything they had been told it was before they arrived. He rode out to the ranch twice with Phineas and walked the property with Susanna and asked detailed and intelligent questions about the operation. And on the last evening before he left, he sat with Phineas on the porch of the townhouse while Susanna put the children to bed inside, and the valley was its evening self, golden and vast and honest. "I was wrong about the territory," Arthur Carson said. "You were unfamiliar with it," Phineas said. "That is the same thing for a man who presumes to judge," his father said. "You are doing something real here. The work is real, the people are real, the place is real." "Yes," Phineas said. "She is a remarkable woman," his father said. "She is the most remarkable person I have ever met," Phineas said, without reservation. His father was quiet for a moment, looking at the mesa that turned its deep burgundy in the last light. "Good," he said finally. "That is the right answer." Arthur Carson returned to Philadelphia and the firm, and he and Phineas corresponded regularly for the rest of his father's life. Letters that were warmer and more honest than anything that had passed between them when they were in the same city, because distance and resolution had done for their relationship what they sometimes did, which was to remove the friction of expectation and leave only the actual warmth of genuine regard. The territory changed in the years that followed, as the territory always changed, with the railroad bringing more people and more commerce, and more of the complications that came with growth, and with the Apache conflicts in the South that were a real and ongoing injustice to a people who had lived on the land for centuries before the American settlement, whose dispossession from their territories was a wrong that Phineas saw clearly and wrote about clearly in his legal opinions and his correspondence with federal authorities, knowing that the writing of truth on paper and its translation into law were two different things, but that the first was necessary to the second, and that silence was never neutral. He took on cases that involved the rights of Mexican land grant holders, whose claims predated the American territorial period, and whose titles were being challenged by Anglo settlers and land speculators, who relied on the complexity of the legal history and the relative inaccessibility of the courts to the affected families. These cases were harder and slower and not always successful, but they were necessary, and he pursued them with the thoroughness that characterized all of his work. Susanna understood all of this because she had built her own understanding of the territory's history from the same commitment to the full truth of a place, rather than the comfortable version of it. They talked about these things in the evenings, in the kitchen, or on the porch, or in the parlor while the children slept upstairs, and their conversations were the conversations of two people who are genuinely in each other's minds as well as their hearts, which is the rarest and best kind of partnership. Thomas started at the schoolhouse in Redemption in 1884, and immediately distinguished himself by asking the teacher more questions than the teacher was equipped to answer, which resulted in Phineas being sent for on 2 separate occasions to discuss whether this was a problem or an opportunity. Phineas took the position that it was an opportunity and brought his son additional books, and the teacher, a young man named Samuel Briggs who had recently arrived from Kansas, agreed after some reflection that it was probably an opportunity, and thereafter directed Thomas's excess questions at Phineas, which suited everyone. Clara was different from her brother in the way that children in the same family are always different, taking the same material and making something entirely her own with it. She was quieter than Thomas and more patient, and she had Susanna's quality of observation, the ability to look at something for a long time without the need to comment on it immediately, and the habit of keeping her own counsel until she had thought something through to her satisfaction. She loved the ranch in a way that was particular and early, following Susanna through the garden and the barn from the time she could walk, and Susanna taught her the names of things with the same careful seriousness she had applied to learning them herself. In 1885, Susanna told him she was pregnant for the third time, and this one she told him with a different quality than the previous two, a quality of settled certainty rather than news, as if the third child were simply the next natural thing in a sequence that was unfolding as it should. "Are you tired?" he asked, because 3 children was real work and he was aware of it. "Not of the important things," she said. The third child was a boy, born in the summer of 1886, and they named him Arthur Eli Carson. Arthur for Phineas's father and Eli for the man who had kept the ranch running through all of it with a loyalty that was never stated and never needed to be. When Phineas rode out to tell Eli Bright that the child had his name, Eli received the information with his characteristic economy of expression, which was to say that he stood still for a moment and looked at the far mountains and then said, "That is a fine name for a boy." Phineas thought it was one of the finest compliments he had ever heard. Young Arthur was, from his first weeks, a person of considerable physical energy and absolute emotional warmth, the kind of child who made friends with strangers and found things delightful and approached the world with an enthusiasm that was not careless but was genuinely generous, and which made him, as he grew, the one who held the group together, who remembered everyone's name and brought people into circles rather than excluding them. By the late 1880s, redemption had grown considerably from the small town Phineas had ridden into in 1877, a young and uncertain man in a wool coat looking for a direction. It was a proper town now, with 2 lawyers and a doctor and a proper bank, and a school with 2 teachers and a railroad stop that had changed the pace and the character of commerce in the valley. Horace Webb had expanded the general store twice, and Pete Hollies had built a proper dining room alongside the dusty spur that served the kind of meals that attracted travelers from the rail line. The church at the end of the street had been expanded twice, and still was not large enough on feast days. Phineas Carson was known across the territory as a lawyer of unusual integrity and considerable skill, and he had declined 3 invitations to move to Santa Fe to practice at the territorial level because redemption was where he lived and where his clients were and where his family was, and he saw no reason to improve his situation by reducing it. He had argued before the Territorial Supreme Court on several occasions and had one more than he lost, and had filed legal briefs that would be read by lawyers in the territory for decades after him, because he wrote clearly and thought carefully, and always kept the actual people in view behind the abstractions of the law. Susanna's ranch was by the late 1880s one of the best-managed operations in the valley, known for the quality of its horses and the productivity of its land, and she had been asked twice to write about her agricultural methods for a territorial farming publication, both times in a way that acknowledged her as an authority rather than a curiosity, which was the kind of acknowledgement that the territory extended more naturally to women than the East did. Because the territory had been built by women's work in large measure, and could not entirely pretend otherwise. She was also the person that new women coming to the valley sought out, as their husbands sought out Phineas, because she was the person who had built something from nothing, and who would tell you the truth about the difficulty without reducing the possibility, and who extended to other women the same practical and genuine help that she had always offered with the unsentimental directness of someone who valued the deed over the gesture. On a May evening in 1889, 11 years after the telegram that had given a young Philadelphia lawyer 30 days to find a reason to stay in the territory, Phineas and Susanna sat on the porch of the townhouse in Redemption, while the valley did its evening best in the warm light. Thomas was 16, and inside with a book that he would later describe at some length at supper. Clara was 14, and at the ranch with Eli Bright, having firmly declared her intention to manage the spring foaling regardless of whether the adults thought she was old enough, which she was. Arthur, 3 years old, was asleep upstairs with the total commitment to unconsciousness of small children. The cottonwoods along the creek were in full leaf, white fluff drifting in the warm air, and the mesa was its deep burgundy, and the sky was the impossible blue that Phineas had noticed on his first morning in the territory and which still struck him as a gift. "I was thinking today about the telegram," he said. Susanna looked at him with the mild interest of a woman who is comfortable in her life. 30 days to find a reason," he said. "And you found one on the first afternoon," she said. "You gave me one," he said. "I handed you a canteen and told you to pay attention," she said. "You did the rest. You were very clearly the reason," he said. She looked at him with the warm directness that 11 years had not reduced or routinized but had deepened, the way a good road deepens with use rather than wears away. "You were always going to stay," she said. "The territory just needed you to meet someone honest enough to show you that. You were that," he said. "And you were worth the showing," she said. She reached over and took his hand, her calloused and strong and warm hand that he had been holding for 11 years, and which still felt like arriving somewhere, and they sat together on the porch, while the valley went from gold to orange to violet to the deep clear black of a territory night. With the stars doing their enormous thing and the horses in the pasture, and the children in the house, and the mesa, and the cottonwoods and the creek, and the sage-scented air, that was the particular honest smell of the only place he had ever truly known himself. The telegram was still in a drawer in his office, not because he needed to keep it, but because he was a careful man who knew the value of knowing where you had started. He did not look at it often. He did not need to. Everything it had set in motion was present and continuous and growing, in the children and the practice and the kitchen garden and the ranch and the woman beside him on the porch who had given him a reason on the first afternoon and had gone on giving him reasons every day since. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, the whole and complete geography of a life, and Phineas Carson sat in it with both hands and all of his attention, paying attention, exactly as she had told him to on that road in April of 1878 with a broken wagon wheel, and the territory, and the sky, and the extraordinary honest truth of her extending all around them like something that had always been there, waiting only for a man willing to see it.